Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad to have you all here. My name is Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton, and I am the Executive Director of the Community Renewal Society. We're so glad to have you, so welcome once again. Community Renewal Society is a 137-year-old nonprofit organization that's committed to eradicating racism and poverty. And we are committed to a vision of beloved community, inclusion, justice, and faith. And the latter is very important because we are unapologetic in our belief that to identify as a faith-centered organization also means you are centered on social justice. We believe that the two are not exclusive, and that is why we are here today. COVID-19 has had a deep impact on faith communities, radically transforming the ways we enter into worship, community, and how we engage mission and service while socially distancing. At the intersections of our faith, we are also wrestling with issues that have predated COVID-19, such as sexism, xenophobia, racism, and yes, poverty. These social disparities like police violence and the inadequacies in healthcare and the prison industrial complex is a part of how we are centering these conversations last week, today, and next week as well. Today's town hall, Jesus and the Disinherited, was inspired by the writings of Howard Thurman of the same title. This is one of 3 town halls in a series entitled Color, Class, Culture, and COVID-19. Last week, we talked about a bomb in Gilead on health disparities. Today, we will address socioeconomic disparities. And next week, we will discuss the global impact of this pandemic. And we are excited because we will have narratives from Palestine, Kenya, Brazil, and First Nation of North America. So we hope you'll join us. Welcome again, and as I prepare to introduce our speakers, please note that you can submit your questions to us through the Q&A section of this webinar, in this webinar portal, and we'll be taking your questions later on. I have renamed this town hall Fire, Fierce, and Fabulous because that is how bad these 3 sisters are. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Erica Williams, our lead organizer with the Poor People's Campaign and the founder of Set It Off Outreach Ministries. We also have Tomi Odunsi, who is a strategy and operations lead with Google New York City. We also have Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks, who's the executive director with A Just Harvest, the senior pastor with San Lucas UCC, and adjunct professor at McCormick Theological Seminary. Their full and dynamic bios can be found on our website, communityrenewalsociety.org. Also, you will find there the COVID-19 resource page that we have compiled with Community Renewal Society. We won't get to cover everything because this is such a rich topic, but we're so grateful for this time together, so we're gonna begin. Howard Thurman's book was a manual of resistance for the poor and disenfranchised. And Jesus was a partner in the pain of the oppressed. Jesus was engaged in the political arena and took on poverty and suffering by going to the margins. So certainly we will do the same, and that's the inspiration of our talk today. I want to begin by speaking to our speakers about the context, the background. What are some of the challenges that we recognize communities of color have faced even before this COVID-19 and the ways that this virus itself has been able to bring attention to those disparities? As you respond, if you can give a brief introduction of what brings you to the table and provide some context from your location. Let's begin with you, Reverend Williams.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so grateful to be with you all today. And Dr. Middleton, thank you for having me, and just grateful for this space to be able to discuss the main things that need to be talked about in our society. My name is Reverend Erica Williams. I hail from Saginaw, Michigan, which is right next door to Flint, Michigan. And 6 years later, family and friends still don't have clean water. So that's what brings me to this conversation today. I'm so grateful for serving as one of the organizers for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, which, as we all know, was Dr. King's last campaign. And I often tell people they didn't kill King because he had a dream. They killed him because he had a plan. And that plan was the Poor People's Campaign. And that was to bring economic justice to this nation. And so here we are 53 years later after Dr. King's assassination to say to America, you still ain't been what you said you would be. And we do know before the pandemic happened, there had been a pandemic. As I said, 6 years ago, people in Flint got lead in their water and they were poisoned by the government, and they still don't have it. And even all across this country, we did an audit for the Poor People's Campaign called The Souls of Poor Folks, America from 1967 to current. You can find it on our website, poorpeoplescampaign.org. And what we found, we had the leading economists, scholars, activists, clergy, and folks to come together. But most important, the people who live these evils daily, the poor and the dispossessed. And what we found is there was 140 million poor or low-income folks in this nation. 140 million. This was in 2018 when we found this out. And what we found out was that it was the poor and dispossessed of this nation that were forgotten, because often we only hear about the middle class. And so what we have to look at is way before the folks start dying from this pandemic, we had over 250,000 people dying a year because of poverty. And so this is a pandemic that we all have been seeing. And so this pandemic is only opening the eyes of those who have been had them closed for so long, because we've been in a pandemic.
Absolutely. So powerfully said, Shay, to that. And yes, this is not something that's new. And as our friend here on the line, Ms. Odansi has shared with us that COVID is disproportionately affecting those of lower socioeconomic groups. And people of color are not only from a healthcare perspective, but also from a financial perspective. Ms. Odansi, can you share a little more about those disproportionate numbers that you see from your location?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this today. So my name is Tomi Odansi, as Reverend Waltrina just mentioned. I live in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm approaching this conversation through the lens of, I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm from Nigeria. I was raised in England and settled in the US as a child. And I've also been afforded the opportunity to progress the ranks of the corporate ladder. And so I've held jobs at, one of the leading investment banks in the world. I've helped C-suite executives answer questions about their business and make really, really important decisions. And throughout my career, I've been in environments where I've noticed this one fact about US history, and that's really that the rich are constantly becoming richer, and the low income and people of color are disadvantaged in many ways. And so I started the initiative called Transform with Tomi, not only to address the wealth gap and issues in career progression, but to think holistically around what balance looks like. And balance really is about mental health, it's about physical health, emotional, spiritual, financial. And my belief is that if you address this from a holistic perspective, you'll lead to a more fulfilling life. And so in this way, I've done a lot of coaching, I've produced content around these topics, and I've also observed in these corporate environments. And if we don't have people on the ground observing the behavior of the rich, then we're not going to make progress. And so from my lens, the messaging is quite similar to what Reverend Erica just shared. COVID is exacerbating issues that already existed in our society. So if you look at unemployment of Black people before COVID, Black people are 2 times more likely to be unemployed versus their white counterparts. And that's the same with COVID. So COVID is highlighting that Black people are more likely to be essential workers. They're more likely to be working as restaurant workers and things of that nature. And this is really something that that we need to attack from a systemic perspective. If you also think about just the need to survive COVID, so, you know, in Chicago, Black people are dying at a rate almost 6 times those of their white counterparts. So it's not just about surviving health-wise, there are ancillary damaging things that are happening in our communities to poor people. And so I'll get into the details a bit later, but the messaging is quite similar. It's that we're exacerbating these systemic issues that already existed in our communities.
Thank you so much. And Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks, you offer us a perspective of those that are directly impacted. And as a direct service provider here in Chicago, Illinois, we'd love to hear more about the ways that you have provided support and what you're hearing from communities that are being impacted in this particular way.
Hi, Dr. Middleton. I just want to let you know I missed half of what you said,
I think we may be experiencing some challenges there. I think everyone, as we know, is using Zoom these days. So we thank you for your grace, everyone, as we try to navigate and adjust. But I will just say that Reverend Dr. Pagan Banks.
we're having some technical difficulties on our end now. But I missed half of what you said, and I wasn't sure if it was because of our end or yours. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We just want to hear about.
Okay.
Yes, if you just introduce yourself and share a little bit about the service that you provide and what you're hearing from the communities that are directly impacted.
Okay. So good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks, Executive Director of A Just Harvest. And I come to this conversation, again, reiterate what's already been said. Poverty was already in place before COVID-19. Hunger was already happening before COVID-19. Not having access to quality health care was already in place. Not having access to affordable quality housing was already in place. Our folks, our family, our loved ones were already locked up because they couldn't pay bail. All these things were already in place, and this virus is just highlighting or uncovering or removing, you know, the veil from people's eyes who maybe didn't know or didn't want to know what was happening because it didn't affect them. And so what we're hearing from the ground now is what's going to happen when this is over. You know, our kids were already suffering and behind in school, and so what's going to happen when this is over? How are we going to make sure that we're not just sheltering in place and protecting ourselves, but that we're finding ways to make sure that whatever we do and whatever changes that we make sure that what happens or what arises out of this is going to be for the well-being of our communities. One of the quotes that I love from our book this morning, is that there are few things more devastating than to have it burned into you that you do not count, and that no provisions are made for the literal protection of your person. And so at A Just Harvest, the work that we do isn't just about serving. It's not just about direct service, even though we want to keep our folks fed and alive while we work this thing out. But we're also constantly having conversations about who belongs and who and why. And for some folks don't belong. So how do we make sure that we are creating a space where we are not just protecting folk now in this situation, but that we are creating systems and dismantling systems that don't work, but creating systems that make sure our folks know that they do belong, that they do count, that we do care about them, that they should have clean water, that they should have access to quality education, and all the things that we've been fighting for all these years that COVID-19 is just bringing to the forefront. So that's what I bring to this conversation, and listening to the voices of our people who are saying, what's gonna be different? What's gonna be different? And we don't want things to go back. And things were abnormal, and things were messed up, and things were not in place for our people prior to this. And so this whole conversation of back to normal needs to be thought about as well. That's what I'm hoping we'll talk about.
Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful that you have joined this conversation as well, because often when we are in a moment of crisis, we forget about the local agencies that provide resources and support. When people are looking for organizations or ways to partner and who can we bring in to support our communities locally, we go out, which is fine, but we also have to be mindful that we have organizations locally that have been committed to supporting our communities for ongoing basis. And so I'm really excited about the work that A Just Harvest shares or engage in our communities. So thank you as well for being on this call. Shared with us that a study found that nearly every disproportionately Black county, 97% had one or more COVID-19 diagnoses compared to only 80% of all other counties. And almost half of those disproportionately Black counties had at least one COVID-19 death compared to 28% of all other counties. And so, Reverend Williams, can you speak to us a little bit more about the history in this country in terms of the communities, the cities, the counties that are impacted, and how, as you noted, you talked about Flint. You know, when we're looking at this pandemic, we're seeing that alignment with the same cities. The statistics, the numbers are quite comparable. And what type of impact is having economically on those communities that you've pointed out in those statistics?
Well, yeah, let us just look to the history of this nation. If you start off with the genocide of the First Nation family, and then you talk about the enslavement of our ancestors, and you think about it, it has taken us 400 years to go from free labor. Our ancestors were considered free labor to $7.25, which is the federal minimum wage at this time. Think about that, $7.25. And so think about it. Black folks in this country, we were never meant to survive. As Tupac, Brother Tupac, who I deem as one of the prophets of our time, said, it's a setup. I know you're fed up, but keep your head up. But what he was saying in the context was it was all set up by design to keep us from thriving. So our communities ain't never had adequate education. They ain't never had adequate health care, ain't never had adequate food. Most of our communities live in food apartheid. Like, it's beyond food desert. Like, it's apartheid. My hometown, Saginaw, Michigan, in a 10-mile radius on the east side of Saginaw, there's only one grocery store, a Save-A-Lot. So most people are only able to get their groceries from a Save-A-Lot or Dollar Tree. So you don't have access to quality things. You don't have access to doctors. So it's no coincidence that the pandemic is allowing us to see what folks haven't had. And so it's just so critical in this moment for us to look through history, how it has always been. One thing we need to do, and I think the ancestors are calling us to do it in this moment, let's have a Sankofa moment. Let's go back and to look at what this country has been. And when you look at it all throughout history, you will see that there has never been a period where Black folks have had the resources that they needed, and in particularly in the South, because I really want to be clear about in the South, where you still got states that have the Confederate flag hanging, there are folks who are still enduring the policies of those Confederate flags. So you have people in states that don't even have Medicaid expansion. So you have to look at just the policies that have been created, even from the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, all of these things that have been gutted to take back the rights of our people. So the pandemic is just really identifying for us what we have seen: no health care, no housing. And let's be real clear, when they're telling folks to stay in place and to stay at home, how the hell are you going to tell people to stay in place and stay at home when over 300,000 folks in this country are homeless?
Right.
Homeless, don't have a place to stay. And in this country, people fail to realize that Jesus was homeless. And this country prides itself on Christian nationalism, but Jesus was a homeless man. And so we have to just be very clear that there have been a lot of policies and statutes put in place from the beginning of this country. The beginning, it has always been profit over people. And that is why a lot of the people of color who were never meant to survive have been put in the place of dying at unprecedented rates because of this pandemic.
And I appreciate that, especially when we're thinking, and I like that you mentioned healthcare. And that's what we're seeing, that the rate of persons that are dying, that are being impacted through the medical healthcare system, are largely disproportionately people of color. And Ms. O'Dunsey, you mentioned that the #1 contributor to bankruptcy in the US is due to medical issues, which is driven by the high cost of healthcare and time off from work. And we already know that the communities that are deeply impacted that may not have the privilege to be able to work remotely are the working class and poor. And so can you speak to, and last week we did talk about health and disparities amid this pandemic. Can you share with us more about the medical issues from a financial perspective and the way that it intersects with this healthcare system that Reverend Williams alluded to in her remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. So one might think that bankruptcy is typically caused by credit card debt or student loan debt or foreclosing on your home, but actually 66.5% of all bankruptcies are tied to medical issues. And the reason for that is because healthcare is so expensive and people don't prepare for emergencies because they don't have the funds to save in that way. And then the second reason is that when you get sick, you have to take time off of work, or when your family gets sick, you have to take time off to take care of them. Who are the people who are most likely to be in jobs that don't have sick benefits or paid leave benefits? Of course, it's low income people and it's people of color. And so COVID is just exacerbating this problem of medical issues, then contributing to financial issues, and then financial issues kind of spiraling out. It's a system that's doomed. And from a healthcare perspective, the health insurance space is quite interesting. It's interesting because folks who are privileged get health insurance benefits through their jobs, aren't offered health insurance benefits. Actually, Black people are about 5% more likely, even if they're young and employed, to not be insured by health insurance versus their white counterparts. And so we have to look at the way that we're protecting our communities when we think about this. And so from an insurance perspective, it's important, and I'll encourage everyone here to understand what actually covered by my insurance provider. We should ask ourselves the question, if I suddenly were to get sick with COVID, would I have to pay for the test? Would I have to pay for my hospital stay? So the first thing around this is awareness. And the other issue that comes into play, particularly with Latino communities, is even just translation issues. So you may be covered, you may not be, but you don't even understand what your healthcare situation is. And think about those people who rely on you. You may not be able to communicate effectively with the doctors or with the healthcare workers around that. So health issues tend to spiral into other financial issues and kind of cause this demise for those low income people who don't have the adequate benefits.
And I agree. And Reverend Pagan Banks, if you can join us in this conversation as well regarding those communities that are, as we said, a lot of people have been made to be invisible in this moment because they don't have the resources. They don't have access, and that's another issue, having access. And someone in our comments said that it is all intersectional. What are the intersections that you're recognizing in the service you're providing alongside these socioeconomic realities?
I mean, a lot of them have already been mentioned, but living wage jobs, of course, being able to afford rent, right? And then understanding the connection between the criminalization of our communities and poverty and hunger. And I think that until we understand, like we've had people tell us, y'all do great work, but why are you worried about people being locked up at Cook County Jail? You should stay in your lane. Well, I'm here to say that our lane is the justice lane. And the folks that are locked up in Cook County are related to the people that we're serving here, and they matter, right? And so like helping folks understand the connection between how the system is set up to criminalize poor folks, how the system is set up to criminalize Black folks, how the system is set up to make it okay to not give a damn about communities that are suffering prior to COVID-19 and in the midst of COVID-19. You know, even the conversation around healthcare or even access to food, you know, I've been pushing back a little bit because up here, you know, we're on the north side, we're close to Evanston, but this area here, this 8 blocks called the North of Howard, has seen huge disinvestments. And while we do have a grocery store, people can't access it because they ain't got no money. And so fine, Jewel did finally come in, and we're glad that they're there, but folks can't shop there. So they're still shopping at Dollar Tree and General Dollar and you know, across the street because it's a little cheaper, but not always quality. And so really, you know, understanding that if we want to really address hunger from a place of ending it, not just continuing to provide a service while it's necessary, but to end hunger, then we have to talk about a fair tax. We have to talk about a living wage. We have to talk about affordable housing. We have to be willing to talk about how to make sure that corporations are paying their fair share and that we're not putting corporate interests before the interests of our people. We have to be willing to make sure that we're investing in our folks who are re-entering from incarceration, that we're creating a community that's prepared to receive them back in such a way that there's dignity, there's work, there's possibility. And so the idea of hitting the block because you ain't got nowhere else to go to make some money wouldn't even cross your mind, because things are put in place to make sure that that doesn't have to happen. And so, you know, again, while we may address this from a place of setting a table, right, a welcome table that's open to anybody who's coming for a meal, it doesn't end there, and it can't end there, because otherwise we're just perpetuating our own existence, doing work that might feel good but ain't doing a whole lot of good in the long term for our communities, and that's what we need to be about.
Well, and
I'm trying not to cuss, but.
I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
You know, I was just gonna say, so I'm glad you said that, Dr. Pagan Banks, because see, what we don't want to talk about is this issue of capitalism. I think we always, we plan around it, we play around it, but that's ultimately the issue of this country. And the reason why now states, in particular here in North Carolina, my home state of Michigan, they're opening states back up so they can get more money to keep this economy going. And what they have said is, we will sacrifice the lives of a few at the altar of American greed. That's exactly what they said. We don't mind some lives dying because we need this economy to run. And so I think we have to bring into this conversation, as the comment said about, yes, these are intersectional issues, because that's what King saw when he started the original campaign. He saw the 3 evils was racism, poverty, and militarism. What you just talked about, my dear sister, Dr. Pagan Banks, and that's what we're seeing now. When you look at the folks fighting you on systemic racism, it's the same folks fighting you on poverty. When you see the folks fighting you on poverty, it's the folks fighting you on militarism and the war economy, how they've criminalized our communities. And what we've come back and said, with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, you got to have those 3 evils, but you got to add ecological devastation, because the poorest of people live in the most deplorable conditions. What did I tell you about Flint? Flint, the water wasn't switched because they just switched the water. 74.5% of the people in Flint were poor. As my grandma say, not P-O-O-R, they was P-O. They couldn't afford the O and the R. And so that's why they switched the water, because they said, your life don't matter, we don't care. We'll switch the water and kill you. And so we got to always keep in mind, it is a system that has been put in place with American greed that will continue to give to big corporations and not to the people.
I want to add also, Angela Davis added to that, she also said, don't forget sexism. We don't want to forget the ways that women in particular are impacted by poverty, impacted by these disparities, and caring for their families, having to work, trying to take care of their health, and also the other discriminations that we see in other intersections, as our commenter made. So I definitely want to lift that up too. And I think Dr. Pagan Banks wanted to jump back in.
No, I was just agreeing.
Okay.
I would love to add to that.
Yes,
it reminded me of the question of, why are certain communities expected to be overburdened by the things that higher income communities are not expected to be overburdened with? And I'll give a clear example of the housing market. no one wants to live next to a garbage dump. No one wants to live in a high crime neighborhood. No one wants to live in a school district where graduations are lower, send their kids to a school where there are lower standardized score. The reason why they do is because it's cheap, because it's affordable. They're buying houses in these markets or renting in these markets. And in 2008, when we saw, the last recession that this company had, people in these poorer neighborhoods lost wealth at a greater rate than their counterparts. And so we're forced into these situations because there's the expectation that we're going to take the burden on of, being in these uncomfortable, dangerous sometimes environments. And then we end up losing more than our counterparts. So I just want to layer that on, in that the financial losses really are tied to this expectation that poor communities are going to be put in these situations that are definitely less than ideal.
We received a question from a Reverend Howell with Metropolitan Community Church, and he stated, it's along the line of what you all are just shared or commented on. He said, last week, the president referred to American citizens as warriors on the battlefield against the invisible enemy, COVID-19, and said, of course, some people will be affected and some people will be affected badly, but we have to get our country open, and we have to get it open soon, which is what you just commented on. And essentially telling American citizens that, well, you're on your own, and it's the survival of the fittest. And some people will just have to be willing to die for the sake of the economy and for the sake of his election. So they're asking, how do we, the quote unquote warriors, take back the power that clearly this country can't function without, leading up to and including the action we call and take on Tuesday, November 3rd. So wanting to know, how do we make sure that we recognize that election plays a critical part in this socioeconomic discourse that we're addressing right now, and that COVID-19 is indeed a socio-political issue that we can't ignore. And any of you can jump in.
So I'm gonna start off with saying that I think as a community, we need our voices heard in spaces where folks are willing to listen to us, and these need to be highly visible spaces. So I'll give an example of, I'm a small landlord in Brooklyn, and I'm in a group with a few other Black female landlords in Brooklyn, which is actually very rare. And we started to notice in the press, there are a lot of articles around rent freezes, mortgage forbearance, things that would directly affect us as small landlords. We're not made out of money, and we're not similar to, the huge giants who do this as their day-to-day. And so we actually took to the press to make awareness of this other group that is kind of ignored. And I would parallel this to poor communities, to people of color. So there was an article in Bloomberg. And so this group reached out to the writer and said, hey, we have a story to tell that's important. It hasn't been told yet. And so we need to tell our stories in these venues. We need to get allies. We need to work with our white counterparts to be heard. And we need to show up at legislative meetings. We need to lobby for ourselves the same way that other people are lobbying. So folks from this homeowners group agreed to drive to Albany to sit in on those meetings, to be represented. Representation is probably the number one thing in terms of having our voices heard. And so in addition to, the elections and making sure that you're informed and vote, we need to be represented, and we need to partner with these mainstream voices so that our voices are heard as well.
Well, I'm going to go back to the old school of Fannie Lou Hamer, and we need to organize. That is exactly what we need to do. We need to, and this is what the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, is doing in this time. We've started a non-compliance campaign, and we said we're going to stay in place, we're going to stay alive, we're going to organize, and we're going to forget the lie. I got to say that one more again. We're going to stay in place, we're going to stay alive, and we are going to organize and forget and not believe the lie. And I say all that because what we got to do in this current moment is we're being lied to, y'all. They're telling us all kind of bullshwanky and things. So we got to know the truth for ourselves, and we have to understand and get a clear analysis as to what's going on. And that's the information we have to share with our people. We have got to be very, very clear about the education that we're doing with folks. And I know in this current moment, a lot of people are doing a lot of charity work, and that's wonderful. Mutual aid is amazing, but you cannot just do mutual aid. King said, I don't want to just give a coin to a beggar. I want to know the system that created a beggar. And so that is what we have to do in this current moment is we got to do projects of survival, and we got to give people political education and get them organized so that they can know how we have to take our power back. We got to organize. And so when it comes to the issue of voting, as I told you, I think today is day 2,653 since the Voting Rights Act was gutted in June 25th of 2013. So we don't even have the full Voting Rights Act backing us up. So we need to organize, one, to get that back into place. Two, we also need to organize to make sure that states make sure they have funding for us to have the election in November, making sure they can have the mail-in ballots so that people don't have to go out if they don't need to go vote. So we got to get organized. We got to bring ourselves together in community to build power. We have got to do that, because one thing I know to be true, they're not going to listen to us if we just come in there and we are rah, rah, rah. No, but when you walk up in there and you got your people behind you and your community is standing with you and we're all together unified under an analysis of what's happening, we cannot be denied. The Reconstruction period showed us that, the second Reconstruction, and even right now as we read the book Reverend Barbara wrote, I'm just gonna throw it in there for my boss. Hey, y'all go and get his book, Third Reconstruction. But we are living in that third Reconstruction period now, and we got to do like the saints of old and the ancestors of old and organize. That is where we're going to be able to combat this issue. We got to build power. And once we build that power, we can impact policies and elections.
And what does organizing and building power look like right now? For those who are saying, yes, amen, I agree with everything you're saying, Reverend Williams, but my church, we are not engaged in social justice issues. I don't have access per se to an organizing system, even though I believe that they do exist. You know, what are some tools we can give folks to help them understand and recognize that organizing is accessible to us all? And before you answer, I want to read what Jackie Baldwin has shared in a comment. She said, I am reminded of FEMA director's statement, you will be largely on your own during Hurricane Katrina. And that statement was true then and has been true during every disaster since then. So thank you, Jackie, for that comment. We wholeheartedly agree. And last week when we spoke on health disparities, we spoke on Hurricane Katrina, we spoke on HIV/AIDS, Flint, and all of these different issues that we see mirrored in this moment right now. So you're absolutely correct. But Reverend Williams, and I also want to pose that question to Reverend Dr. Pagan Banks as well. What are some of the solutions or tools that we can give people to help them understand that organizing is accessible?
I think.
Did you want me to go first or her? Please go, Dr. Banks.
I agree with everything that you just said, Reverend Williams, wholeheartedly. And I think that in answer to your question, Dr. Middleton, it starts with having conversations. Like sometimes we think that it's really complicated, but it's not. We got to get to know our folks. We can't assume or presume to know everything everybody is wanting to do, hoping to do, able to do. But so it starts with seeing them first, see them, and then have conversations with them, listen to what folks are saying, because a lot of times, you know, in order to get them committed to organizing or connected, they have to understand the connection to their situation. So politicizing the situation, politicizing their anger, politicizing the things that they've been let down by, helping them to see the connection to what they're experiencing is not as an individual. Yes, it's happening to you, but it's systemic. How do we help folks to begin to politicize their situations and understand the connection to the intentional system that's been in place forever, right? So I think starting with that, and so the tool that we give our folks is just to say, have a conversation. Ask people what inspires them or what wakes them, keeps them up at night. Like begin to really hear what our communities are feeling, what they know and what they don't know. and allow them to hear what you don't know, right? Be willing to be vulnerable and not say, hey, I've got all the answers, but that together, when we organize, we're coming up with the solutions and the answers as we deconstruct the system, right? So, really engaging at the street level. Y'all know that I like to say that I'm hood and holy. I got to stay at the street level in order to hear people and to see people and to let them know this ain't about me trying to do something for you. This is us trying to do something for our people, for our communities. And to say that we're warriors on a war. Come on now, we fight wars every day, and we ought not have to constantly be fighting these wars, and now we got to fight this other war too. No, and the organizing that we're doing, we also have to figure out, how do people understand the election system? We got folks right now outside the door who because they got a $1,200 stimulus check, think dude in the White House now is the best thing since sliced bread. And it's like, no, first of all, he didn't give you nothing because that was our tax money anyway. Secondly, it's just to distract you from the billions that were given to corporations. And thirdly, when things didn't happen with the other administration, you need to know what's in place. How does the system work so that you don't just point a finger to say, for example, what I just heard a young person say, Obama didn't do nothing for us. Well, how do we help them understand why President Obama was blocked every other way when he was trying to do something, right? How do we help them understand the role of Congress, the role of their legislators in the state, so that voting isn't just every 4 years, but the civic engagement and the getting folks to understand the importance of voting is happening constantly at every level, and that they understand who you need to go after in any situation, because that's where the decisions are being made. So the organizing, I know I've said a lot, but the organizing, it starts with the conversations, but also just an awareness that sometimes folks, are thinking the decisions are made in one place when they're made in the other. So.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Odunsey, Reverend Williams, if you'd like to respond as well. I do have a comment from Jerry Shaw on that same vein, who says, how do we organize in areas where internet is not accessible for everyone, which also speaks to those disparities in terms of wealth. We do see that one response to this is that people are being granted access, but then what happens when we consider that we're safe and those communities go back to not having access? And you have some schools with the privilege of having online learning, whereas there are others that they don't even have a computer. So even if you give them access to the Wi-Fi, they don't have those essential tools, cell phone, smartphone, a computer, laptop, etc., to be able to tap into their education, to organizing platforms, and the like. How would you all respond to that? And I know Google, and not putting you on the spot, Ms. Odunsey, but I know that Google has definitely been a resource long before this in terms of providing resources for schools. But what can you say in terms of the need to be able to have access to technology and the socioeconomic challenges that people face trying to gain access to those resources?
So I'm going to echo what Reverend Pagan Banks said, in that on the ground work doesn't require access to internet or access to technology. So part of the reason why I believe in what Google does is because we actually have a lot of initiatives on the ground to bring access. Our mission is about providing access to information to people globally. And there are projects where they're bringing Wi-Fi to communities that don't have Wi-Fi, et cetera. So that's kind of one issue. And I think it's a long-term issue that will take years to resolve. But I think there are still ways that we can organize even if we don't have access to technology. So for example, there are a lot of local kind of advocacy groups that are really involved in on-the-ground work. I was just talking to someone last week about a nonprofit in Brooklyn that goes out on the street and stands there and tries to mitigate violence amongst people. That type of work that's being done, it's being done in pockets and can be found by just having those conversations, like Dr. Pagan Banks said. And I think that this on the ground work is meaningful. It brings back that human element that so much of what technology has given us, as much of a blessing as it is, has taken away from, you know, the civil rights leaders. They weren't on social media all day posting about this person died and we need to get back. They got together, they talked to their next door neighbors, and they decided, okay, I have a group of 5 people. This person knows that person. I think that is one of the most effective ways of organizing. And yes, technology is great because it provides us with that scale, but there are ways to do this on a human one-to-one basis.
Thank you. Reverend.
So I'll start and say, when that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew stepped on the scene, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to set the captive free, and proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord now." And then he closed the book and he said, "The scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing today." And he basically told him, the day it's on. And from that point forward, he went about with the disciples going 2 by 2. Jesus was a community organizer, getting folks organized all across Nazareth. What good could come out of Nazareth? All across the different places and all the different spaces, Jesus organized. And the very book that Dr. King took with him wherever he went was Jesus and the Disinherited. It was found in his suitcase wherever he went. What did King do? He went around organizing. My dear sister told me, just said it. They didn't have internet. They didn't have technology. They went door to door. They went talking with people. And so I say all that to say we've gotten too comfortable. We have allowed things to be excuses of what we can and we cannot do. And I tell you, I study at the helm of Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Josephine Baker. Ella Josephine Baker, who was one of the greatest organizers of all times. And she said, strong people don't need leaders. She said, all you got to do is equip people to give them the power to make the change. And so what we have failed to do is, and a lot of times, is we want to be comfortable and we don't want to get out and do the spade work, as Ella Baker talked about, which was going door to door, talking with people, making phone calls, having community conversations. And this moment is calling us to do that. I actually live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where SNCC was started, at Shaw University, where Ella Baker worked. And I've been just like going down by Shaw from time to time saying, Ella, speak to us. Tell us what you think. And Ella is saying, get back to the work. We've gotten so caught up in social media. Everybody wants a platform. We just got to do the work. And we've got to go back to our people. And we don't need to go back telling them what we think. We need to listen and let the people who are most impacted be the leadership of this movement. And we build from the ground up and we take back our power and make movements that have not been seen in this country. So organizing can be done. It has been done. And if we don't get a clue in this current moment, when we are in the biggest wealth gap in history of this country from what we're seeing, because this 140 million poor low income folks that we know is only going to get wider. It's only going to get wider. They are cutting jobs every day right now. We got to go back to beating the streets. We got to go and do whatever we got to do. And I know we got to stay in place, but we can do some things in the midst of a pandemic. And that is what I hope we really recognize, because at the end of the day, all power belongs to the people, because we only challenge and perceive power. They don't have it, we have it. And we got to get it together and organize.
Right. And I think that's really important to recognize that even before we all had quote unquote access to technology, we had to use our prophetic imagination. We had to find creative ways to be able to resist. And that's what Howard Thurman was talking about in Jesus and the Disinherited, about resisting. It was about Jesus resisting by being on the side of the oppressed. And it does not matter if you're a Christian or not, but just recognizing that as marginalized communities that are being threatened to be disinherited, and many have been disinherited, what can we do to organize ourselves in order to resist and say that our humanity matters, and insist on having access to these very simple things like having access to water, having access to healthcare, having access to education, having access to a place to live and a job once you are a returning citizen to our society. And so making sure that we honor those narratives and make sure that we realize that we, as you have said, are empowered, that we're not helpless. And I want to point out that CRS is working on fair tax, and you can learn more about some of the ways that CRS is organizing around a lot of these issues that impact us economically. We have our CRS newsletter, and we definitely want you to sign up so that you can receive more information about how to support our fair tax campaign. And you can sign up at communityrenewalsociety.org/email-updates. And we will also provide more information in the chat section of this webinar conversation. So all of the organizations that our speakers today are affiliated with, we've had links to their organization in the chat. So you can go there to find out ways that you can stay engaged with the work that they're doing in our communities. So we want to celebrate them, and we want to continue to stay in touch. We have a question from Wilbert Watkins, and he said, and I think this would be a good one for you, Reverend Pagan Banks. He said, Mayor Lightfoot said Chicago is partnering with organizations to help build greater equity, and he's speaking specifically in healthcare outcomes among people of color. But are you seeing the partnership from a local level, state level, supporting providers like yourself in the work, in the outreach, the tremendous outreach that you're doing in the community? And can you tell us, what do you need on the ground to continue to provide that service and support?
So I do want to say, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. As you know, Dr. Middleton, I'm always fighting to make sure that those of us that are on the ground doing this work get the support that we need to do the work effectively, right? We don't want to just be putting Band-Aids on gashes that are happening here. And so I don't think we ought to have to fight so hard to get that support. I don't want to sit here and act like we don't get any. We gratefully got the Chicago COVID Response Fund grant. But I feel like if I'm not shaking trees and constantly waving my hands and pointing out situations that sometimes the folks on the ground are not getting, and I don't mean just financial support, but just like, you know, the ideas, the ingenuity, the connections, the network, sometimes that's not happening, right? And again, if we're in this work and we're doing it, it shouldn't be so hard to figure out how to connect to the broader partners in terms of the city, the state, and nationally. And so I think being able to connect with others doing the work in ways that is going to help us increase our capacity. If we're doing work to keep our folks from getting shot and killed right here, because as you know, we just lost a young man last week. Then so how do we connect their families? How do we, you know, and when he came to me asking for a job, I didn't have an answer for him. So being able to connect to the work that's happening around the city, we need to stop these kind of generalizations around, you know, where Black and poor people are, because sometimes this side of the city just kind of gets forgotten because there's an assumption, there's this generalization that happens. And we do know that Chicago is a very segregated city. But we also know, because of how the, you know, as you know, from back in the day when public housing was torn down, when communities are being gentrified and people are being displaced, our folks are everywhere. But it doesn't mean that when we get pushed someplace that we have the resources that our neighbors might have, right? So here we are in Rogers Park. But I know that in these 8 blocks called north of Howard, 98% low income. You know, the school is always on the chopping block because it's underperforming and under-resourced and under-enrolled. Our folks are in and out of jail. Our folks are in and out of mental institutions. You know, so how do we like really find our people, connect with them, and then make sure that we're connecting to the resources broadly and not, you know, what sometimes things are done, and I'm not saying that any organization shouldn't get support, but sometimes it's like, if you ain't sexy enough, if you ain't loud enough, and if it ain't gonna bring whoever's given the resource enough attention, then you're not gonna get support. And so I'm here to say that those of us on the ground across the board need to find ways to collaborate and be supported in a way that's gonna make sure nobody falls through the cracks. Nobody, right. We don't need, we're not trying to have this, the famine and the feast kind of thing going on, right? And let's pour a bunch of resources into a particular place because we know it's needed, but then not think about it systemically so that the changes that need to happen. And then because what happens is that organization might have the resources they need, but it doesn't necessarily, make its way to the broader community to make sure that the systemic changes are happening. I'm sorry if I'm rambling because it gets to be exhausting, right? And if we're already called to resist, we're already called to fight, we're already called to try to survive, who got the energy left to try to ask somebody for some help when it ought not be so hard?
And as you pointed out, and also just the whole emotional, spiritual, psychological impact that we're experiencing. I mean, someone mentioned Hurricane Katrina earlier, and that brings us in our last few minutes to think about how do we not be in this place again? How do we equip ourselves so that when our government cast us aside and tried to disinherit us, how do we reclaim and honor and affirm our humanity and do what we need to do to protect ourselves? And I want to ask Ms. Ladonsi, and I'm going to ask all of you as well, you shared with us that what folks can be doing right now during this season is to get their finances in order. You talk about addressing budgeting, saving for emergencies, debt and investing, and preparing for healthcare, tax-sheltered investments in your healthcare. I want you to build upon that to give us some direction on where to go forward. And then I want to ask the same of our other speakers as well. From your location, what do we need to do right now to prepare for the season ahead? Ms. Ladonsi.
Sure. So understandably, a lot of folks are going through a storm right now that is COVID, and perhaps have lost their jobs or have reduced wages. So I like to call it the four fundamentals. So for weathering the storm, you need to just be focused on eating. So food, you need to be focused on paying your utilities, paying your rent or mortgage, and lastly, clothes and transportation. So those are the essentials. If you're going through a storm, shift your focus from paying off any debt or credit card debt. Those things can wait. Focus on those four fundamentals. For folks who are just kind of wondering, what is the outcome? How do I prepare myself and set myself up for success once this storm is over? Think about your financial habits. And I think the number one and the first place to start is your budgeting habits. So I promote doing this, whether it's on an Excel sheet, on a piece of paper, using a fancy app such as Mint or YNAB, some form of budgeting to show you what COVID actually means for you from a financial perspective. And I've also gone through this exercise to say, okay, I'm not spending as much on this category, but I do have to spend more since I'm home on this other category. So that would be my first piece of advice, is implement some form of budgeting. When it comes to investing, which I think there are a lot of conversations around, how are the markets going to do after this? What should I be doing with my stimulus check? Should I save it? Should I spend it? Should I give it? You have to focus on where you are in your financial journey. So if you have a lot of debt on your plate, which most Americans do, I would focus on debt repayment. If you do want to invest, focus on the long-term investing and not the gimmicks. So the thing that the government isn't telling us about some of these help initiatives is that they're not really help. They're loaning you money that you're going to have to pay back sooner than you think. And they may call it a grant, but it's really a loan. And when that balloon explodes at the end, you're in a financially worse situation. So it's almost a setup. So I encourage you to think about your financial constraints in the context of a budget, and read the fine print on anything that you take on during this time, because there's a lot of fine print out there in terms of what the government is offering. So I would say budgeting, focusing on debt repayment, and then educating yourself on some of the healthcare options. So healthcare.gov is a great resource for folks who may not know where to start. You can get access, you can figure out what you may qualify for based on your income level or other options that are different from employer-based healthcare plans, and also HSAs, which are health savings accounts that can be used for the rest of your life, and you invest in those tax-free. And so from a healthcare perspective, that they're one of the best ways to build wealth from a healthcare perspective. And then lastly, emergencies. So 46% of Americans would not be able to cover a $1,000 emergency. And COVID just revealed that, you know, we have tenants renting who wouldn't be able to do it. We have landlords renting who wouldn't be able to cover it. The Cheesecake Factory didn't have an emergency fund either. So it's a system built on this debt culture. And so we have to move away from that and start setting concrete financial goals. And I've shared a few links with Waltrina to share around financial literacy and even some grant options. And so I really encourage you to take this time to focus on what can I do now to weather the storm, not just now, but for when the next storm comes. It's not an if, and for when we get out of this one.
Thank you. And we have shared the links that you provided us and have spoken on into the chat. So, and we'll make sure everyone has access to that. Thank you for those brilliant tips. I hope folks will definitely consider those. And we are about to leave Miss Reverend Pagan Banks. She has to jump on another call. But before she goes, can you just briefly share what you would like our community to hear in terms of how we can prepare for the next season ahead, if you're still with us? Did she have to leave already? Okay, it looks like she had to jump off. And we just want to celebrate her and thank her, but we also want to invite you to please go to ajustharvest.org to learn more about the phenomenal services that Dr. Pagan Banks and her community provide. And we want to thank her for being able to join us. And also, before we conclude, I want to make sure that Reverend Williams also have an opportunity to share some resources to help us look ahead.
Well, I can hear the ancestors singing, oh, oh, freedom, oh, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was their song of resistance and their song of calling each other to come together, to fight together, to change their economic and their social plight. And so I say to all of us today, this is not new. We have been in this since the beginning of time. And if we look back, especially at the 1930s with the Great Depression, we will see how we have been able to overcome and to work together to come through this. And so I know that we still have to feed people and take care of people in this pandemic. And I would encourage churches. We need for a lot of our pastors and imams and rabbis to come together and not be chaplains of the empire, but to be prophets of God, of Allah, and come together and speak out against the injustice, and to let our faith centers be places to help our people and to be able to provide for people. But also, we got to have a moral revolution of values in this country. We have got to have a revolution in this country. We're not going back to the way it was. We have got to come together and change this nation. And we have a golden moment right now. People who normally don't want to hear this, they're hearing it now, because most Americans were almost $400 away from an emergency. And so what we know now is a lot of people are wondering, what do we do? And so the word is today I will share with you is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival. We're having a mass assembly, Poor People's March on Washington, June 20th. Hear me, June 20th. And so you can go to june2020.org and sign up today. And we're getting poor folks from all over this nation, all over the world, comrades from South Africa, from Brazil, from Palestine, India, coming to stand with us and say to America, be what you said you would be. promote the general welfare of all people. And so we're building power together to change this nation. So we hope you will join us on June 20th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to make that clarion call to this nation. And so we're going to get what we're asking for. We're no longer asking, we're demanding. And so would you stand with us and join with us to build power? Get your community together, get your church together, and make sure we stand together. So we thank you for this time together, Dr. Middleton. This has been amazing, but we know we can't stay here. We got to get our power together and take back this nation.
We 100% agree, and Community Renewal Society is in solidarity with you, with all of our
Have we? Oh, it's like, have we lost you?
Yeah, I did go out. So I don't want to play with the technology gods. So we're gonna wrap it up. But I want to say thank you all so much for this rich conversation, for the wealth of knowledge and that you bring along with your deep passion for social justice and reaching out to our community to ensure that we're empowered. And know that we do have all that we need within us to be able to respond to this pandemic with the same fortitude and resilience of those who came before us, who also face challenges of their own. We will make sure that we continue to share the resources that you provide so that folks can connect with you. This has been recorded and will be archived on communityrenewalsociety.org's website. And we also ask you to join us next week, where we will continue this conversation. As Reverend Williams noted, we have to remember our interconnectedness. So next week, we will be looking at this from the perspective of the global diaspora. And we will have speakers from Palestine, from Kenya, from Brazil, from the First Nation of this country, and immigration experts here in Chicago. So it's going to be another rich conversation, and we hope that you will join us again next week. Please register and submit your questions in advance. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you to our panelists. Ms. Odunsey, thank you so much for being with us. Reverend Erica Williams, Reverend Pagan Banks in her absence. We just thank you all so much. We're very grateful. Remember to visit communityrenewalsociety.org to receive all of our COVID-19 resources. I wish you all a wonderful day. And